The word compromise is one of the most irrational and morally dangerous words known to the American political universe, and I will tell you why in a moment. My friends, if you appreciate this message, I must ask you to do one thing, or a few things actually. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe this content, comment on this content. Every single bit helps me get the message out. Now let us proceed to my analysis. My friends, over the past week, Capitol Hill in America, as the day of this video, has been plagued with political dramas and skirmishes. As if it's not already, it's plagued plenty of days of those things. But over this past week, it's been particularly intense because there have been a few things that have been coming up. There's been a debt ceiling crisis that is coming up. There has been a government funding crisis that is coming up. In fact, before this week, there was speculation the government might shut down and put a lot of people out of work temporarily in the middle of what is still a very volatile pandemic. There's also infighting within the Democratic Party about Biden's infrastructure agenda, weighed against the more progressive side of the Democratic Party's desires to have increased social spending, increased welfare, the sort of increase of the welfare state, and the centrists, such as Joe Manchin, not wanting to do anything about it. There's been a lot of political football happening. And all honesty, the political football does not necessarily interest me. What interests me, however, is as it relates to the debt ceiling crisis and the government funding crisis and any other major crisis that's been happening recently. These crises, at least an approach to them, is always justified on the basis of compromise. Indeed, the infighting and the sort of coming together to scheme and work on certain plans was called by Jim Paskey and Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota as simply what democracy looks like. So they've justified a lot of the stuff that's been happening, the craziness, the fighting, the sort of ideological jousting, by simply saying this is all about democracy. And my friends, whenever the debt ceiling comes up, because it comes up very often in politics, because the government keeps borrowing money, and it always needs to raise its limit on how much money it can borrow, because again, it's the one who controls all the shots in this instance, and the United States dollar is upheld solely on the full faith and credit of those who decide to use it. And even though that full faith and credit is still fragile, the dollar remains a dominant currency throughout the world. There's a question as to how long that's going to stay. But the real question here is this. Whenever the debt ceiling comes up, I always hear a single word uttered called compromise. Well, it's time for Republicans or Democrats to compromise on this, come together for the good of the country. That is always a line. That is a tired line repeated by every single politician that wants to raise debt ceiling or wants to approach an issue, I argue, uncritically for the sake of producing a consequence that is temporally beneficial but eternally harmful. And this is actually what happened in the negotiations between progressives and centrists in their own party. The idea of democracy being this sort of fighting out between ideas and like coming together to agree on some things. But all this compromise, all this coming together overshadows the fact of the matter. And the fact of the matter is it more important to compromise for the sake of compromise? Or is it more important to compromise, if we compromise at all, for the sake of obtaining a truthful end? And my friends, the idea that politicians who swore on the Constitution, swore on the Bill of Rights, should compromise about the United States economy, should compromise about how much the government should be able to spend, seems to me to be a really bad false choice. What do I mean? Well, so here's what I mean. If I have oil, and I have water, and I have an automobile, and I know that oil is what the automobile needs for its engines to function, and water would destroy it, the compromise mentality would tell me, hey, go ahead and compromise between these two choices. Or at least that's what it means when taken to its logical conclusion. Now, some folks may say, well, Christian, you're being hyperbolic. I'm not. Because if we know in that situation that oil is the only thing that we need to make the car run, and that water would destroy it, why in the world would we compromise between oil and water? We can apply this same principle in different terms to political situations. If we understand what is morally just according to the framework of the American experiment, why in the world would we compromise on a matter that endangers those very same principles? For example, the debt ceiling simply represents, my friends, a perverse relationship between the government and the economy, a relationship which should not really even exist if we're being honest, because the economy represents the voluntary, willful, boundless intellectual energies of vast amounts of people from from America and outside of America coming together to trade and exchange their goods and services with each other, and the government simply represents a massive amount of force. The government is simply a mass, a contained, controlled mass of force which acts with force. And force, as a principle, stops things. It interrupts things. Force does not create things. The economy, on a principle level, creates things. It innovates. It's ingenuitive. There's a reason why the government is not so good at inventing things, because the real genius, the real creativity, comes outside of the spectrum of force, and it comes from the corners of society, which are not so concerned inherently with force. They're concerned with voluntary cooperation. But the debt ceiling has been staked as vital for the survival of the American economy. So why in the world is how much the government spends vital for the existence of our economy? Because there is such a perverse interrelationship between the economy, the Federal Reserve, and every other financial institution linked some way, shape, or form to the federal government and to the broader economy as a whole. It should not exist. It should not be like this. But unfortunately it is. And so now, political considerations are now economic considerations, even though political situations or considerations operate by a very different set of laws and principles than economic ones operate from. The initial principles, the underlying principles of a political consideration have to do with what is best for whatever group wants to do this, what is best for quote unquote the country. Economic considerations don't care about that. They care about what is best for the folks who are exchanging goods and services, and ultimately a lot of those things tend to be best for people as well, because it creates more value. This is the principle of spontaneous order that F.A. Hayek hatched in his brilliant treatise, and that was actually hatched way before him. He actually came way after the fact this was discovered. The idea of the sociability of men, the natural law theory, is understood as the very basic building block of society, and yet we have a single measure which all of our existences and our economic affairs is staked upon: the debt ceiling. And the more the government is able to spend, the more it's able to borrow, the more debt it accrues, and the more prevalent and the more potentially disastrous these future conversations become. Because I promise you, my friends, the debt ceiling will continue to come up time and time again. It always has. It always will. And the more the government possesses in debt, the more disastrous potentially defaulting would be. So why in the world would you compromise on principle level on the economic security and safety of people by raising the debt limit and not take a stand and say, no, forget being fiscally irresponsible? That's the line that Republicans use all the time. Forget that. I don't care about that. How about the fact the government should have absolutely no intervention in the fiscal affairs of society in the first place? Forget being fiscally responsible, because all being fiscally responsible means is that the government should be more responsible with how it spends my money. How about the government not spending my money whatsoever and not getting my money whatsoever unless I give it to them? That is the moral decision here. That is the moral quandary here. And yet, we forget these underlying issues and we perpetuate broken, immoral, and false systems on the altar of compromise. It makes no sense logically to keep letting someone who is spending, overspending, borrowing more money from itself and from other people, not paying it back, inflating the value of the currency, to continue to let them do that. And it is not principled to stake all of our economic destinies on that one thing. But, once again, all we hear is this idea of compromise. And other than compromise simply ignoring the immoral tragedy of a government getting more and more involved, adding more and more emphasis on my personal financial deeds, not misdeeds, but deeds, maybe even my misdeeds too, it also suggests that the political status quo should always be upheld, regardless of what lies beneath. All compromise says, my friends, is that we need to operate within this very confined framework and system that we've all agreed is what is proper. So Congress has agreed that it is proper to keep borrowing money because guess what? It keeps the economy going, it keeps the country going, and yet we never question why in the world is the fate of the economy of free people with their energies dependent on a mass of force which was erected to protect those people, not to direct those people, not to rule those people, not to chaperone those people in their own personal personal affairs, why is there such a powerful relationship? The idea of compromise ignores that question entirely, reaffirms the status quo, and keeps us all in immoral territory. That's why I don't want to hear about compromise. If I know what is right, if I know what is moral, I should not care about compromising towards something that could be potentially immoral or disastrous or irrational. But you may accuse me of not wanting to collaborate. So there's a difference between collaboration and compromise. So if I collaborate with you, and I talk with you, and I work with you to get somewhere, if I'm not sacrificing my values, if I'm not sacrificing my morals, and we're both working towards the same exact end, in this instance, the end of all politics is only morally supposed to be the end of ensuring that human freedom is as uninhibited by external factors as possible. That is the only moral end of politics. But it's been expanded by the progressives in the 1920s, by all kind of forces, by the moral majority in the 80s, to mean so many other things than what it in its foundation is meant to mean. But you expand the political meaning of government. And all I'm saying is, if something goes beyond the initial purpose of government, I don't want to compromise. I want to get the government back to its initial purpose. Then we can work towards anything else. So yes, I will collaborate with people that want to protect the individual. I will collaborate with folks that affirm these moral absolutes. I will collaborate with folks that recognize the purpose and the necessity of free individuals exchanging value in a voluntary manner through economics. I'll collaborate with those kind of folks, even if we may have different forms of how we want to do things. So for example, an anarcho-capitalist has a very different way of how they want to ensure liberty than I do, but I can still collaborate with them. But when we're talking about people that actually want to keep the government perpetuating this false status quo that gives us a false moral decision, we're talking about people who actually want to make sure the government can continue to control our economic relationships. This is not something we compromise about. This is something we must resist as a moral people. So no, forget compromise. Compromise does not take into account what is right and wrong. It takes into account what is politically and strategically beneficial to the folks making policy. And guess what? I don't really care about the folks making policy. I care about making just policy, correct policy, moral policy. And if you're an American citizen and you care about the ethos of this country, you should as well. Think on it. My friends, if you love me, please go to patreon.com/officialcwatson, PayPal, officialcwatson@gmail.com, or locals, christianwatson@locals.com, or my Discord, which is in the comment section down below. My friends, I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.